10,000 torches flickered in the humid night of Susa as Alexander the Great watched his elite Macedonian guard take the hands of 10,000 Persian brides. This was not a celebration of love, but the birth of a new species of empire, a fusion of blood and culture that the world had never seen before. We are often taught that Alexander was a destroyer, a man of fire and iron who smashed the old world to pieces. But in those final years of his life, he was obsessed with something far more radical than conquest. He was dreaming of a utopia where the concept of the foreigner would cease to exist. Imagine standing in that massive courtyard in Susa, the air thick with the scent of expensive resins and the sweat of men who had marched through the Gedrosian desert. You see the Macedonian veterans, men who had followed Alexander from the rainy hills of the north, now dressed in flowing robes of purple and gold. They look uncomfortable. They are soldiers of the phalanx, used to the weight of the sarissa and the simplicity of the camp. Yet here they are, being ordered to marry the daughters of the very people they had spent a decade killing. Alexander sits above them all, wearing a mix of Greek and Persian regalia, believing that he can stitch two halves of the world together with a single ceremony. This vision was called Homonoia, a Greek term meaning oneness of mind or conquered. To Alexander's teacher, the great philosopher Aristotle, the world was divided into two types of people: the Greeks, who were born to rule, and the barbarians, who were born to be slaves. Aristotle had explicitly told his pupil to treat the Greeks as friends and the Persians as animals or plants. But as Alexander stood on the banks of the Oxus and the Indus, he saw something Aristotle couldn't. He saw a Persian nobility that was just as brave as his own, and a culture that was older and in many ways more sophisticated than his own. He decided to throw his teacher's manual into the fire. The dream of a unified humanity started small, with the adoption of Persian clothing. Alexander began wearing the white tunic and the sash of the Persian kings, a move that horrified his Macedonian generals. To them, this was a betrayal of their heritage. They saw a king who was going native, a man who was losing himself in the luxury of the East. Can you feel the tension in those royal tents? The silence that would fall when Alexander entered the room, his boots clicking on the marble, wearing the diadem of a conquered people. His men didn't want a world citizen. They wanted a Macedonian king who would lead them home to their wives and their farms. But Alexander's utopia was moving towards something much larger than fashion. He began drafting plans for cities that would serve as the nervous system of this new world. We call them all Alexandria now, but to him, they were experiments in living. He envisioned these cities as melting pots where the Greek gymnasium would sit next to the Persian fire temple. He wanted the youth of Asia to be taught the Iliad, and the youth of Europe to understand the administrative genius of the Persians. He was building a bridge across the Hellespont, made not of wood, but of shared language and shared blood. The escalation of this dream reached a breaking point at a place called Opis. His soldiers finally snapped. They were tired of the Oriental court ceremonies, tired of being told they were equal to the people they had defeated. They staged a mutiny, shouting that they wanted to go home and that Alexander could go on his conquests alone with his new people. Alexander's response wasn't to punish them with the sword, but with an emotional plea that still resonates. He shut himself in his tent for 3 days, refusing to see anyone, until the soldiers broke down in tears outside his door. When he finally emerged, he didn't just forgive them. He held a massive banquet for 9,000 people where he prayed for the Persians and Macedonians to rule the empire in common and in harmony. Yet, there was a darker, more awe-inspiring layer to this utopia that he kept hidden in his journals, a set of documents known as the Hypomnemata, or the Last Plans. These plans were so ambitious, so terrifyingly vast, that his successors would later suppress them, fearing they would bankrupt the world. Alexander wasn't planning to stop at India. He was planning to build a road along the coast of North Africa all the way to the Pillars of Hercules, a highway that would connect the entire known world. He wanted to build a temple to his father Philip that would dwarf the Great Pyramid of Giza, and a tomb for his friend Hephaestion that would cost the equivalent of billions of dollars in today's currency. But the most extraordinary part of his secret plan for Utopia was his project for the transmigration of populations. He intended to forcibly move thousands of families from Europe to Asia and thousands from Asia to Europe. He believed that if people lived together, married one another, and farmed the same soil, the very idea of us and them would dissolve. He wanted to physically rearrange the human race to ensure that no one would ever have a reason to go to war again. It was a vision of peace achieved through the ultimate act of royal will. A world where everyone was a stranger, and therefore no one was. As he lay dying in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, the heat of the summer pressing down on him, the dream was already beginning to fray. He was only 32. The empire was a sprawling, chaotic beast held together only by the force of his personality. His generals stood around his bed, their eyes already darting to one another, calculating their shares of the map. When they asked him to whom he left his kingdom, he supposedly whispered, "To the strongest." In that moment, the utopia of Homonoia vanished. The oneness of mind was replaced by the clatter of swords, as his empire was torn into pieces by the very men who had stood beside him at the Susa Weddings. The tragedy of Alexander's dream is that we only see the ruins. We see the broken statues and the Greek names of cities in the middle of the Afghan desert. We see a man who wanted to be a god, perhaps because he realized that only a god could convince humanity to stop hating itself. We are left to wonder if his vision of a borderless world was a beautiful blueprint for the future of our species, or if it was the ultimate delusion of a man who had conquered everything except his own restlessness. If he had lived another 10 years, would we be living in the world he imagined, or would the weight of his impossible utopia have crushed us all? We like to think of history as a series of inevitable events, but standing in the shadow of Alexander's ghost, you have to ask, was the world truly ready for a man who wanted to erase the very idea of a country? Are we even ready for this today?